The next step in the process of finishing our tile floor is grouting the floor. The tiles have been set in the floor and they've actually been able to cure for over 24 hours. And you want to make sure that you allow enough time for the tiles to dry in the thin set on the floor, because you don't want to be walking on them if they're still not securely set in the thin set, because if you do, you're going to loosen them up and they'll pop off and you're really not going to have a good job. So you want to make sure that you let the tiles dry sufficiently before you walk on them. There are several tools that you need in the process of grouting the floor, and again, there's many different ways to do this. This is just the way that I've chosen to do it, the way that I've done it many years, many times, and found it successful and it works. First, you need plenty of water in the process, so you have at least 2 buckets of water, clear water, that you'll be using in the process of grouting the floor. Another very important tool, so to speak, is a sponge, and you want a sponge that's got a smooth side on it and also a rough side on it for cleaning the tiles as you go along. Another very important tool in the process, this is a gum rubber float that you use when you take the grout. You use this to force it down into the joints between the tiles, so you should have one of these. I use a putty knife also for some corners and things for forcing the grout down into the tiles, so this is something I use as well. And some people use gloves, some people don't. You'll find that if you don't use gloves in the process, the grout is very drying on your hands. So if you're concerned about your hands being extremely dry and shriveled up in the process of getting your hands in the grout, you can use gloves. So I'll be using those as well. You're also going to be doing a lot of kneeling in the process, so if you've got bad knees or you want to protect your knees, you can either use knee pads or you can use a board like I do with some towels on it, so you have something to kneel on. So that's pretty important too. Again, there's many different ways to do this. This is just the way that I do it, and I found it to be pretty successful. So let's go ahead and get started in the process of grouting the floor tiles. To get started in grouting your floor, obviously you have to mix up some grout. So you follow the same procedures that you normally would for mixing some of the other products that we used in the floor, some cement-based products. This is a sanded grout. It's a polymer base. You mix it with water. It does a pretty nice job. There's basically 2 different types of grout that you can use. There's sanded grout and unsanded grout. And the difference generally is if you're going to have joints between your tiles that are less than 1/8 inch wide, then you'd use a non-sanded grout. If you're going to install tiles with a 1/8 inch or wider seam between them, you would use sanded grout. And basically what it is just grout with sand in it. It helps fill the gap a little bit better. So the wider the gap, obviously beyond 1/8 inch, you use the sanded grout. Grout is sort of a personal preference as far as what color you can go with. If you go to your big box store, you can get a color chart. There's quite a few different choices in color, and you really have to decide the color of your tiles and whether or not you want your grout to stand out, to contrast, to blend. My floor tiles here are sort of a beige-ish, brownish color, and I've decided to go with a grout that's a little bit lighter. You could call it off-white, or maybe you could call it a tan color. Gives a little bit of a contrast on the floor, so that's the color that I decided to go with. So there's some choices to be made there. And again, mixing up the grout, you mix it up in a bucket using the same procedure or follow the directions on the bag. You want it to have a consistency of like creamy peanut butter, so when you apply it to the joints, it's solid enough that it actually will hold its shape, but not too loose that it runs all over the place. So again, follow the directions and mix up your grout and let it set a little bit before you apply it to the floor. The process of installing the grout is a pretty simple process. You take your float, you dip it in the bucket, you get some of the grout out, force it down into the joints of the tiles. Work it in, make sure that it's worked all the way down to the bottom of the joint. You don't want to leave any air gaps or holes or anything in the joints themselves. So you simply take it, work it down in. Very simple. Again, the most important thing is to work it down into the joints to make sure that you've got them completely filled with grout so there's no air bubbles or gaps down below. Now you take the sponge and you make sure that you move it across the tiles, giving them a smooth finish. The important thing is to keep cleaning your sponge often. And that's why I use 2 buckets of water. I use one to primarily get all the grout off the sponge, and then the second one is a second process of cleaning the sponge a little bit better. After you've gotten most of the grout off the floor, I like to use the chamois as the final process because it cleans up better than a rag does. It sucks up some of the moisture on the floor a little bit better. So my particular choice is to use a chamois. Be sure to take the grout and work it very good down into the cracks in between the tiles. That's very important to fill all those gaps. When cleaning the excess grout off the tiles, it's pretty important to draw your sponge at sort of a 45-degree angle across the joints. That'll help you clean some of the excess grout off, but will also not tend to pull too much of the grout out of the seam, and you don't want to do that. So you do that carefully, make sure that your surface is flat, and you draw it 45 degrees across the joints of the tiles.